Mother, man.
Spreading faster than a case of the clap in a trailer court. Able to shatter eardrums within a 666-mile radius. A podcast more brutal than all the rest. It's murder! Metal! Mayhem! The Bells of San Pedro, written and narrated by Pete Altieri. Part 1. It was a beautiful, crisp October morning when I arrived in the small rural town of San Pedro in northwest Mexico. It was my first time leaving the United States, but I had no problems getting through border security at Nogales on Highway 19. Originally from Indiana, I moved to Cottonwood, Arizona when I retired from teaching high school chemistry a few years ago. Like most Midwesterners I met since relocating, I didn't miss the harsh winters one bit. It took me a couple of years to get used to the heat of the summer. Living my life in retirement meant I could stay inside when I wanted to. The days of fighting traffic and having to go to work were already a distant memory. A letter from an attorney notified me of the death of my uncle Luis. I inherited a duplex which he owned in San Pedro. The tenants living in the upstairs apartment would be taking care of the place until I decided what to do with the property. I was surprised to find out about the inheritance since I hadn't been very close to my uncle. The last time I saw him was on Christmas Day when I was 10 years old. Luis never married or had children. From pictures the attorney provided, the duplex looked like it was in good shape, with a half-acre of land nestled in the beautiful Sierra Madre Mountains. I didn't know what I was going to do with the place. I only spoke a little Spanish, but since it was close to the U.S. border, many of the locals spoke English, according to a woman at the San Pedro Town Hall. I decided to make the trip and see what it was all about. My internet search showed San Pedro had a population of only 813 people, according to the last census. My mother's maiden name was Ramirez. Her sisters, Mercedes and Elisa, and her brother Luis stayed in Mexico. My mother left for the United States when she graduated high school and received a scholarship to Indiana State University. She met my father upon graduation, got married, and had me a year later. I was an only child. We had visits from her siblings a few times over the years and always talked about taking a family trip to Mexico, but never did. We would get the customary holiday and birthday cards from Mexico and phone calls on holidays, but that was about it. I knew I had several cousins and a large extended family there. As an only child, I dreamt of going to Mexico to see them. I followed the directions I was given to find the duplex on Siesta Ridge Street. I drove slowly through San Pedro and was amazed to see no one outside on such a beautiful day. The town appeared to be deserted. The downtown area had only a few shops on each side of Main Street, but each one looked like it was closed. There was a post office, a small restaurant, a second-hand clothes shop, and a barber shop. None of them were open. I passed by St. Peter's Catholic Church and a smaller Amigos Christian Church. The houses I saw were small and modest, but the yards were meticulously kept. Most were single-story and made of adobe or stucco, which was common to the area. I still found it odd no one was outside. I didn't even see other motorists out driving. The few cars I did observe were parked in driveways. I didn't see a dog, a cat, or any living thing. It was unnerving. I turned west on Siesta Ridge Street as the directions said and found the white stucco duplex with the flat roof easily. It was the only house on the block, and there was a cemetery across the street. It didn't bother me that it was there, but I did find it odd no one said anything to me about it. It was relatively small but well maintained and surrounded by a wrought iron fence with a gate. There was a sun-bleached wooden sign above the gate that read, Cementerio Siesta Ridge. There appeared to be only 20 or so headstones. I was amazed to see an abundance of yellow flowers adorning each of the grave sites. Some of the displays were more ornate than others, but all of them appeared to be covered in a colorful floral blanket. There were elaborate archways constructed of the flowers and messages written among the displays. I parked my car in the driveway to the left of the duplex. It appeared no one was home. I saw no other cars. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from behind me. It sounded like a bell on a child's bicycle. I quickly turned around and saw a young boy, about 10 years old, riding a bike down the short gravel driveway from the cemetery. He was coming toward me, ringing his bell. "Hi, how are you?" I asked, smiling. The boy stopped and looked at me inquisitively. I wondered if he spoke English. "Do you speak English?" I asked him. He smiled. "Yes, I do. You must be new in town." He spoke with an accent, but his English was very good. "Yes, I am. Where is everyone?" "You're the first person I've seen since I got to San Pedro." The boy put his foot on one of the pedals. "Everyone leaves San Pedro on this day every year, before it gets dark." The boy had a serious look on his face. His words hit a strange chord with me. "Really? Why is that?" The boy smiled and began pedaling. "Beware the bells of San Pedro, sir. At midnight it will be the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos." I smiled back and waved as the young boy rode his bike down the street, gaining speed as he turned on Main Street, heading toward downtown. He appeared to almost vanish from view. Living in Arizona for the past few years, I knew Mexicans celebrated the Day of the Dead instead of Halloween like in the U.S. They pay homage to the dead and celebrate their lives on the first 2 days of November with parties, food, and offerings to their lost relatives and friends. Beware the Bells of San Pedro was on my mind as I put my key in the lock of the downstairs apartment of the duplex. It seemed to be a strange thing to say. What bells? Maybe a church? I wondered why the citizens of San Pedro left town before the Day of the Dead. Something was gnawing at me. Part 2. The downstairs apartment was well kept and sparse, with ceramic tile floors throughout and exposed wood beams across the ceiling. My uncle had a few houseplants in the front window, and it appeared the upstairs tenants had been watering them. There was a living room with a couch, recliner, and a small television mounted to the wall above a bookcase. A vase with a bouquet of the same yellow flowers I saw in the cemetery was on the coffee table. I smiled at the coincidence. A hallway led to a bedroom on one side, a full bathroom on the other, and at the end was a kitchen with a small table and 2 chairs. I peered past the curtains of the back door, and there was a covered patio with a grill and rocking chair. 2 cypress trees cast most of the backyard in shade, which was nice. The front and side yards were landscaped with colorful decorative rocks with dozens of large cactus plants and feather grass. I was impressed and thought maybe I would consider living in San Pedro during the winter. I didn't get snow often in Cottonwood, but it did get cold on fall and winter nights in the Verde Valley where the sun dipped below the mighty Mingus Mountain. I sat down on the couch and read a book I purchased on Mexican customs and looked forward to the section of the Day of the Dead. In it, they mentioned the significance of marigolds and food to entice the dead to appear for their loved ones. Suddenly, I was startled by a knock at the door. I stood up. "I'll be right there," I said, slowly making my way to the door. The long drive waged war with my sciatica, leaving my legs stiff and sore. I opened the door to see a young man in his early 30s, with a thin mustache and a wide-brim hat. "Welcome to San Pedro, friend," he said, smiling broadly. He had a slight Hispanic accent, but his English was excellent. "You must be Mr. Salerno. Please come in," I said, taking a step backward. "Please, David, you could call me Lorenzo. I hate to be so formal," Lorenzo replied. He shook my hand vigorously. "Well, fair enough, Lorenzo. Thanks for taking care of the place since Uncle Luis died. I appreciate it." I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, hoping there would be something I could offer him. No problem. Luis was a great landlord and friend. He was always pleasant to my wife and we never heard a peep out of him in the 2 years we've lived here, Lorenzo added. I'd offer you a beer, but the fridge is empty, I said, smiling. That's okay. My wife Susanna and I would like to invite you upstairs to our apartment. She's been cooking for 3 days straight. We knew you were coming, so we wanted to show you how Mexicans really celebrate the Day of the Dead, Lorenzo said. His eyes sparkled. She's preparing some of my favorite dishes I had growing up in Mexico City. Well, that sounds fantastic. I felt a slight hunger pang in my stomach. The Mexican food sounded good, especially since it was authentic. Great. We'll see you at 6 o'clock. Is that okay? Yes, 6 o'clock is great. Do I need to bring anything? Lorenzo smiled. Just your appetite. Okay, then. Why does the whole town clear out for Day of the Dead? This kid on a bicycle told me that. He was coming from the cemetery, I said, making eye contact with Lorenzo. He's the only person I've seen in San Pedro before you knocked on my door. That's true. The whole town of San Pedro leaves the night before and doesn't come back until it's over 2 days later. They're afraid the grave bells will start ringing in the cemetery. Lorenzo took a step toward the front door. Grave bells? What are they? I've never heard of them. It was customary in the 1800s for people to tie a bell to their arm or leg in case they were buried alive. The bell would alert anyone above ground the person was really alive. Years ago, it was more common than you think. Some wealthy people had caskets made that could open from the inside and provide oxygen in case of such a thing, Lorenzo explained. Well, that makes for a good spooky story, I said, laughing. It certainly does, David, Lorenzo smiled. My wife and I wanted to stay behind and enjoy the food and drink. This year is special since you've come to visit. I may go take a walk over in the cemetery. There were so many brilliant yellow flowers there. It's a wonderful Mexican custom, I said. Yes, the marigolds are very festive. Just beware the bells of San Pedro, Lorenzo added as he stepped outside. We'll see you at 6. I looked at him with a shocked look across my face at the mention of the bells. That's odd. That's what the boy on the bike said earlier. Lorenzo laughed. I didn't know what to do but smile back uncomfortably. Part 3. I took a short nap and walked across the street to the cemetery. I was amazed at the displays of brilliant yellow marigolds on the graves as I passed through the gate. Their fragrant odor permeated my senses from every direction. It was almost hypnotic. I saw a small cottage or casita at the south side of the cemetery behind a row of peyote trees. It was most likely where a caretaker would reside. I continued to walk around, noting some of the more elaborate displays with archways made of wire and intertwined with the yellow flowers. Some had signs made with their loved one's name, beckoning them to come back to the living on the Day of the Dead. Some of the displays had offerings of Mexican sweetbread decorated with skulls made of sugar and other sweets. The cemetery was bigger than I expected when I first looked at it from the driveway of the duplex. There were more like 50 or so buried here. Most of the headstones showed departed died in the 1800s or early 1900s. As Lorenzo said, there was a straight metal pole that came up from the ground next to the headstone, and at the end was a simple bell. Upon closer inspection, I saw the bells were attached to a pole by a thin cord, the other end tethered to the deceased. I had never seen grave bells before, and the idea of it sent a chill through my body as a breeze swept through the cemetery. Clouds had found their way into the afternoon sky, obscuring the sun and making it considerably colder. I wished I had a heavier jacket. I approached a random headstone for a Diego Sosa Rodriguez, born in 1855 and died in 1899. His headstone was rather simple, as were most of them in the small cemetery. He had a grave bell like the others. I was compelled to touch the bell, but wasn't sure if I should. Was it a violation of the deceased to touch their grave bell? I wasn't sure, and there was no one to ask, but I did it anyway. I even pulled the cord to sound the bell, which rang out louder than expected. It startled me. "I wouldn't do that, senor," said a voice behind me. I stood up, embarrassed I had done it. The man standing before me wore a blue work shirt and pants with a baseball cap, the brim pulled slightly down. He was holding a rake, his face and hands dirty, like he had been working hard. "I'm sorry," I replied. "I meant no harm." "It's bad luck to ring the grave bells," he replied. "My name is Roberto. I'm the caretaker here at the cementerio," he said. His English was decent and heavily accented. "Again, I'm sorry, Roberto. I wasn't sure what else to say." "I'm surprised you're still here, senor. Everyone leaves San Pedro before it gets dark on this night. You don't want to be here. I'm going to my brother's house for a few days," Roberto said, smiling. "He lives on the beach." "Thanks for your warning. I've heard that a couple of times today. Beware the bells of San Pedro. Leave town. It will be dark in a couple of hours. Then it will be too late." Roberto turned and walked back toward the casita. Part 4. I left the cemetery after the strange discussion I had with Roberto. I entered the apartment and freshened up in the bathroom and changed clothes for dinner at Lorenzo's place. The incredible aroma of Susanna's cooking filled my apartment. It found its way into the crevices and swept through like a wondrous miasma of flavors. I hadn't eaten a thing since arriving in San Pedro several hours before, and now I found myself salivating. I tried not to let what Roberto said bother me, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't rattling around in my head a bit. I couldn't understand why every person I'd met since arriving in San Pedro told me beware of the bells. I had never heard of grave bells before today, but even so, it seemed strange that everyone in San Pedro was compelled to flee before dark the night before the Day of the Dead. It was almost 6 o'clock, and I made my way to the upstairs apartment. The smell of her cooking was rushing toward me. My stomach growled again. I was just about to knock on the door when it opened. "Welcome, David," said Susanna, her hair pulled back into a bun and a big smile across her face. She had a marigold pinned to her blouse and seemed to be wearing a lot of makeup. Her accent was slightly more pronounced than Lorenzo's. The apartment was dim. Only candles were providing the light. She was taller than I expected, but she was pleasant looking. She moved back into the shadows of the apartment. I noticed they also had a vase of marigolds on the coffee table. "It smells incredible in here. Lorenzo said you've been cooking for days," I said, stepping inside. The apartment was decorated like the one downstairs, with little furniture, ceramic tile floors, and the same wood beams. The layout was a mirror image of downstairs. There were more plants and some Native American artwork on the walls and various knickknacks. The decor was a bit dated from what I was expecting, as young as Lorenzo and Susanna appeared to be. In the background, I could hear some mariachi music playing. It set a nice tone for the occasion. "Thank you. Yes, he's correct. I sent him to Sorrento to get a few things we needed. Nothing is open in San Pedro. He'll be back in a few minutes. Please have a seat and enjoy the music," she said, gesturing to the couch. I sat down, basking in the amazing smells coming from the kitchen. I was even hungrier than I thought, my stomach now in full growl. "Would you like some atole?" Susanna asked. "It's a hot drink with vanilla. It's fantastic. A common thing for us to drink on the Day of the Dead and other holidays." "Yes, that sounds wonderful." "Help yourself to the fiambre salad on the coffee table, David," she said, walking toward the kitchen. "I left some plates, silverware, and napkins." "Thank you, Susanna." On the table in front of me was the fiambre salad with various cubes of cheese, rolled up cold cuts, and an assortment of pickled vegetables. It reminded me of my Italian grandmother's antipasto before large Sunday dinners. I put some of it on a plate as Susanna returned with the drink. "Oh, that smells wonderful," I said, as the scent of vanilla wafted to my nose. "Thank you. All the food and drink we'll have tonight are classic Mexican dishes for the celebration, Susanna said, glancing to her marigold. Just like the marigold, it guides the spirits to join us once again. They are drawn to the vibrant colors and aromatic smells. Yes, I saw them in the cemetery. They really are wonderful. I took a bite of the fiambre salad and it was very tasty. It was a little spicier than my experience with antipasto, but it was good. The atole was hot, but I managed to sip it. The fresh vanilla she used was fragrant. Yes, I even used marigolds that Lorenzo brought home to make some of the tortillas we'll be eating. They're actually very tasty, Susanna added. Interesting. I'm sure everything will be good. Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight, I said, sipping on my atole. I hope you like the marigolds we set in a vase for you. It was Lorenzo's idea. Yes, they definitely brighten the place up. Susanna stood up. Let me go check on the tamales. I'll be back in a few minutes. Enjoy. She smiled and went to the kitchen, humming along with the music. Susanna was gone for several minutes, but with the appetizer and the tasty atole to drink, I didn't mind sitting back and soaking in the atmosphere. I felt much more at ease after my odd encounter in the cemetery. The flickering of the candles made the room appear to move with the soft music Susanna put on. I felt incredibly relaxed. Suddenly, Lorenzo entered the living room. He must have come in the back door. "Hello, David. Long time no see," he said, grabbing a plate of his own to try the fiambre salad. "It was nice to meet your wife. She's lovely," I said, sipping my drink. "Yes, Susanna is one of a kind," Lorenzo said. "She's got a bit of a headache, so she's lying down for a while. She gets them from time to time." "Oh, that's too bad. My late wife used to get them." "Yes, they are not pleasant. Sorry to hear about your wife." "Yes," I replied. "My wife Sharon died from a massive heart attack only 2 months after we both retired from teaching." "Well, we can go to the kitchen and start eating. It might be a couple of hours before the medicine makes her headache go away," Lorenzo said, standing up with his plate. "She told me to start without her, and she'll join in when she feels better." I followed him into the kitchen. The food smelled incredible. Susanna had it set up nicely for us to self-serve and take what we wanted. There was more of the fiambre salad with different cheeses, tamales that she made with roasted poblano peppers, rice, black beans, sweetbread decorated with skulls and bones made of sugar, and the homemade tortillas she made with the marigolds to fill with chicken, beef, and pork, and an assortment of grilled vegetables sizzling in their respective pans. "I hope you're hungry, David. There's a lot of food here," Lorenzo said, opening a beer. "Would you like one of these? It's from a local establishment, Molina Brewery." "A cold beer sounds really good. I can't thank you enough for inviting me up here tonight." "You're welcome. Now, let's eat," Lorenzo added. Part 5. It was almost midnight before I got back to the downstairs apartment. I was feeling the effect of the multiple beers that Lorenzo served me, making sure I held firmly onto the handrail on my way down. The beer went down nicely with the tremendous food that Susanna prepared. It was too bad her headache kept her from the feast. I'm sure they'll be eating leftovers for days, since she cooked plenty. I had multiple plates myself and was feeling like I overate, but it was easy to do. Susanna made a wonderful dessert with cooked pumpkin and a caramel sauce called kalbasa and tacha. It was unbelievably decadent after eating a huge meal. A distant rumble of thunder rang out, followed by a crack of lightning, which sounded like it was close. Then a steady rain began to fall. I could hear it against the window of the bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, ready to put an end to a very long day, when I heard a sound that made my pulse quicken. Could it be a grave bell? It sounded just like the one I rang earlier in the cemetery. Or was Lorenzo playing a joke after telling me about the superstitious citizens of San Pedro and their palpable fear when it came to the Day of the Dead? It didn't make any sense to me that they would go to all the trouble of adorning the graves with marigolds, food, and other offerings, and leave town before the sun set on October 31st. Why even bother? I sat perfectly still, assuming the noise I heard was something other than a bell. Then it sounded again, a brief pause, and then another. Thunder cracked and sizzled across the sky, sounding like it was extremely close. I gingerly walked to the front of the apartment and peered between the curtains at the cemetery across the street. The rain was coming down steady, and I saw no one. I laughed to myself and started to walk back to the bedroom when the bell sounded again. This time it sounded like more than two. Then it rang again and again. I was frozen in absolute fear, afraid to look across the street. I wondered if Lorenzo and Susanna heard it. I considered going up to their apartment to ask them, but I didn't want to seem like some frightened schoolgirl after watching a scary movie. The bell sounded again. It sounded like several at once. Suddenly, the shrill sound of a phone rang, and I could feel my heartbeat thunder under my chest. It was like an old-style house phone ringing. I hadn't heard one of those in years. I didn't even realize there was a phone in the apartment. My cell phone hadn't gotten a decent signal once I'd gotten into the mountains, but I enjoyed the detached quiet. The phone rang again before I was able to locate it on the wall of the kitchen. Hello? I consciously tried to slow my heavy breathing and cup my hand over the phone. There was a loud static in my ear. I struggled to hear if anyone was on the other end. Another loud boom of thunder sounded, followed by a flash of lightning that lit up the living room for a moment. Hello? I repeated. Suddenly, I heard a bell ringing, like on a bicycle, the same one I heard earlier when I arrived at the duplex. How could that be? It sounded again. It was so strange, like it was coming from half a mile away, barely audible. My mind was reeling in the mayhem, and I felt dizzy. Beware, beware the bells of San Pedro, a quiet voice said on the other end. It sounded like the boy from earlier, but it was difficult to tell. He was muffled and drowned out amidst the sheer chaos enveloping around me. Who is this? I asked, my voice quivering. Another flash of lightning illuminated the entire living room. The rain was coming down harder now, striking the window like tiny fingers tapping in unison. The wind was howling, unforgiving. Suddenly, there was a dial tone in the receiver. I hung up the phone. What the hell is going on? I asked aloud and walked back to the front of the apartment. I made sure the front door was locked and the deadbolt engaged. I did the same with the back door. Thankfully, they were both very sturdy, custom made from locally grown oak. I heard the grave bells ringing repeatedly, each one sending goosebumps to rise across my skin. I staggered around the apartment, not knowing what to do. The grave bells were distinctive, and the same one I had heard earlier in the cemetery when Roberto confronted me. How could they be ringing? Were the dead rising from their graves? How was that possible? It's bad luck to ring the grave bells. I could clearly hear Roberto's voice warning me. Were some teenagers playing pranks in the cemetery? Maybe they thought it would be a funny joke to play on someone new to town. I thought about what the boy on the bicycle said, as well as Lorenzo and Roberto. No one in San Pedro stays after dark on this night. Was it because of the grave bells? They sounded again, repeatedly for a solid 30 seconds, and a wave of tremendous panic swept over me. I didn't know what to do. A strong wind picked up outside, roaring past the duplex, bringing with it a torrent of rain, even more than before. The storm outside was relentless. I heard no noise upstairs. I wasn't sure if Lorenzo or Susanna heard the grave bells, but as loud as they were, I didn't know how they couldn't hear them. The grave bells continued, increasing in volume, and I began to look for something to use for protection. It seemed silly to consider it, but I wasn't sure what was going on. I stared at the curtains on the front window and wanted desperately to look, but I was afraid to. Despite my fear, I crept close to the window and gingerly moved the curtain so I could look out. To my horror, a menacing face smashed up against the window, causing me to fall back to the floor. It was dark outside and the rain was coming down hard, but I know what I saw. It was a human face, Though dead, rotten flesh peeling and bones protruding from it, it was ghastly. Another boom of thunder shook the duplex. I quickly looked outside again, and the undead creature was gone. A moment later, there was a noise at the front door. It started out like a simple knock, and at first, I thought it was Lorenzo checking to see if I was okay. But it got louder, and within moments turned into a violent pounding. While this was going on, I heard something beating on the front window, and I feared it would shatter the glass. Now the frantic sounds were coming from every direction, and something was pulling on the back door, trying desperately to get inside the apartment. This was sheer insanity, as I cringed at the cacophony of sounds. Lightning sizzled outside once again, illuminating the entire apartment like a flickering bright light. The phone began to ring again in the kitchen, but I wasn't about to answer it. I feared who or what could possibly be calling me. I ran to the bedroom, desperate for some means of escaping the madness outside. There was no basement for me to hide in. The duplex was built on a solid concrete slab. I could hear the undead groaning and screeching as they clawed at the sides of the apartment. Thankfully, the stucco provided a sturdy barrier, but I was concerned about the windows and doors. Just then, I heard the shattering of glass in what sounded like the living room. Were these infernal creatures in the apartment? How was I ever going to protect myself from all of them? I stood on top of the nightstand that was next to the bed and began to frantically pound my fist on the plaster ceiling, hoping to get Lorenzo's attention. I prayed that he would be able to hear me, but there was no response. The pounding was louder now on all sides of the duplex. I could hear them outside the bedroom window, panting and grunting, wanting to get at me. I knew now why everyone had warned me about being in San Pedro after dark. What happened to Lorenzo and Susanna? Could they possibly be sleeping through this madness? I continued to bang on the ceiling to no avail. I jumped down to the floor and ran to the bedroom door, sliding the bed against it to bide myself only a few seconds before the infernal things would get at me. I cowered in the corner of the bedroom with my hands over my ears and my eyes closed. I didn't know what else to do. They were beating on the flimsy bedroom door. It was only a matter of time before they would break it down. The wind outside was howling. The rain was relentlessly streaming down. The phone continued to ring continuously. And the undead from the cemetery were making sickening sounds. They crept closer. There was a distinctive stench of rot that swept into the bedroom. I could hear them out in the hallway. They could smell my fear and knew exactly where I was. I assumed they were all over the duplex by now. I hoped that Lorenzo and Susanna would be able to get away. They were such a nice couple. The last thing I remember was the shattering of the bedroom door while a horde of the dead stumbled inside and tore me to pieces. Part 6. 3 weeks later, the remains of David Russo were found in the bedroom of the downstairs apartment of the duplex on Siesta Ridge Street. A concerned relative contacted the local San Pedro Police Department when David didn't come back to his home in Cottonwood, Arizona as planned. There wasn't much left of him when they got there. He was basically a stain on the rug and some torn clothing in the corner of the bedroom. The dead devoured him. All of the windows in the duplex were shattered, with glass shards found around the perimeter of the house. The front and rear doors were broken to pieces. Splinters of wood were found in several feet of every direction. Whatever broke the doors down was determined to get inside. It looked like a bulldozer had its way with the compromised structure. The floors were soaked from water intrusion and were already buckling. The police officers shook their heads in disbelief, but they knew what happened. Lorenzo and Susanna Salerno were nowhere to be found. The police didn't know where they went or much about them at all. Lorenzo's real name was Dylan Shane Truitt, and he was a fugitive from the United States. He escaped from a mental health facility in Illinois 2 years before, and authorities had no idea he crossed the border into Mexico. Dylan Truitt was a formally diagnosed schizophrenic with a severe personality disorder. He was known to impersonate women as well as other men and was extremely convincing doing it, which is why David believed that there were two people in the upstairs apartment. Uncle Luis believed Lorenzo and Susanna were a couple, and they had been good tenants. At the time of the discovery of David's remains, Dylan Truitt was on the road, searching for a new place to call home, but no one, including him, knew where that was. It would be another week before the police would find the body of Roberto in the casita. He was murdered by Dylan Truitt a week before David arrived in San Pedro. With Lorenzo's disturbed mental condition, he also liked to impersonate the caretaker of the cemetery, donning his work uniform. Dylan liked scaring David as Roberto, adding to his fear of the ominous grave bells in the cemetery. Anyone in San Pedro that drove by the duplex knew exactly what happened. They knew the undead from the cemetery were able to tell that someone living was inside, and they did what they needed to go in order to devour them. This would explain why no one in San Pedro stays in town after sundown on the night before the Day of the Dead. Some have asked why they leave flowers in the cemetery if they are so afraid of what will happen. The people of San Pedro are superstitious, and in their collective minds, appeasing the dead is what you do. They just don't want to be around when the dead come looking for someone to thank for the beautiful flowers. People sometimes claim to see the 10-year-old boy on his bicycle if they find themselves in San Pedro late in the afternoon on October 31st. His name is Guillermo, and he died in 1931. He was struck by a car driving near the cemetery and rings his bell to avoid it from happening again.
Mother, man.